Hello everyone, Jonathan Meek here with Clear to Close, bringing you the best guidance for a fast, efficient, and error-free closing. On this channel, we provide videos just like this one, designed to educate buyers, sellers, real estate agents, and other settlement professionals on the best tips and strategies for a successful real estate or business closing. So let's dive in. Alright, so you just finished the first phase of the residential real estate transaction process, and that is the contracting phase. We've gone through the offer, some negotiation around that, and you have executed a final agreement for the purchase of the home. The very next thing we're going to do is take a look into the property, and the look into the property stage is the second stage of the residential real estate transaction process, where we do three things. Now, I haven't come up with an acronym for this, so if you can provide that for me down below in the comments, that would be great. I'll try to use it. But today we're going to look at the survey, the home inspection, and the appraisal. So I'm going to go ahead and get this door cracked open so that we can look into the property. All of the action that takes place in the third phase of the residential real estate transaction process takes place within the bounds of something called the due diligence time period. This due diligence time period was a time period that was set out in the contracting phase, where the buyer paid a small amount of money to the seller to open up the property to allow for research to happen, where the buyer can go in, take a look into the property, and make sure that there are no defects or any problems with the property that would prevent the buyer from wanting to continue forward with the contract. There is another amount of money that's typically deposited along with the purchase contract. And that earnest money is there just to tell the seller, I am taking the opportunity to do this in earnest. I intend to actually purchase this property. Now, if the buyer gets information that would cause them to want to cancel the contract, and that information comes in after the due diligence time period is already completed, then it's a high likelihood that that buyer would have to forfeit that earnest money to the seller. So I'm going to take a little time to talk about the things that I think are the three most important items that the buyer needs to take care of during the due diligence time period. Those three things are the home inspection, the survey, and the appraisal, and I think that all of those need to be done and completed with all reports in before the due diligence time period is up. And we're going to talk about all of those individually next. So the very first piece of due diligence that a buyer needs to collect on the property they're about to buy is the residential home inspection. Now, the residential home inspection is usually completed by a home inspector that is licensed in the state where you're purchasing the home. That person has gone through a licensing procedure to make sure that they are well versed and knowledgeable in how to look at the systems of a home and determine whether there are any issues that should preclude the buyer from purchasing it. So for example, a home inspector is going to go onto the property and inspect the plumbing systems, the HVA systems, the electrical systems. They're going to take a look at the roof and make sure the roof is intact and that all of the walls and the foundation are solid on the piece of property. Once they've taken a look at all of those things, they're going to put all of the information that they found about any defects in the property into a report and deliver that to the buyer. That report is going to be the information that the buyer uses to make any repair requests to the seller. So once the home inspection is complete and the negotiations are complete around the repairs, it's time for the buyer to determine whether or not they're going to continue through with the purchase of the property. If there are defects with the home that would prevent the buyer from wanting to continue on with the purchase, now is the time to find those out, and the home inspection is the best way to do so. Now, the second piece of due diligence that every buyer needs to get on a piece of property is the land survey. The land survey is created by a land surveyor, someone who is licensed in the state that you're buying the property in, to take a look at a piece of property, determine its borders and make sure that there are no encroachments or issues there, and also to look internally to the property to determine whether there are any easements, violations of those easements, or a setback line that might prevent certain structures or things to be built in a certain way on the property. You want to make sure that none of the structures on the neighbor's property have encroached on your property, meaning they are crossing that borderline. And in the same way, you want to make sure that no structures on your property are encroaching on theirs. The buyer needs to know these things before the end of the due diligence period so that they don't inherit any of the problems that may come along with an encroachment or an issue with violating an ordinance. The third piece of due diligence that I would like to have every buyer have completed before the end of the due diligence time period is the appraisal of the real property. Now, the appraisal is done by an appraiser who is going to look at the property and specifically two factors of the property. One is going to be the actual condition of the property itself, look at to make sure that the property is not in shambles, that there's no major repairs that haven't been completed or need to be completed. They're going to take a look at that to determine what they think factors in into the value of the individual property, and then they're going to take a look at market factors, things like comparable properties, what they've sold for, and the market activity in the area, and those types of things. The final value of the property is going to be used in the transaction in two main ways. First, to determine whether the value of the property is actually commensurate with the purchase price that is in the contract. The purchase price that's in the contract needs to be changed if the value of the property is too low. If the value of the property is too high, it may not need to be changed, but it may cause the buyer who is borrowing to need to bring more money to the table. Lenders base the thresholds of what they're able to lend to a borrower to close the transaction off of the final value of the property. Meaning, if you have a value of the property that comes in at $100,000 and the loan program or the lender only allows you to borrow up to 80% of the home's value, then you would only be able to borrow up to $80,000. Likewise, $90,000 if it's 90%, or in the rare instance that you find a program that allows you to borrow 100% of the loan's value with either mortgage insurance or something like that, that value still is the threshold for which they're going to be able to allow you to borrow. For instance, if you set a purchase price of $110,000 on that home that is valued at $100,000, the lender will only be able to lend up to $100,000, not the $110,000. So the borrower would still have to bring $10,000 to closing. Knowing the final appraised value before the end of the due diligence period makes it easy for a buyer to determine whether or not they can pay for this transaction, or if they're going to run into issues with not being able to borrow enough money, or run into issues with paying too much for the property. So by having this appraisal done during the due diligence time period, the buyer can make that determination and decide whether or not they're going to cancel the contract before it goes too far and they would potentially lose any earnest money or cause any more issues with the transaction. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Clear to Close. I hope the information provided has given you a better grasp on how to look into the property to determine if it's the property that you want to buy before the end of the due diligence time period. If you're liking the content of these videos, please hit that like button and let us know. If you have any comments or questions that you would like to have answered, please put them in the comments section below and we'll respond as soon as possible. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode where we talk about the third phase of the residential real estate transaction process, and that is the ordering the documents phase. Here's a hint, I get to act a little bit more like an attorney in that particular episode, so I look forward to bringing it to you. Until then, we'll see you next time on Clear to Close.